Hi, we're talking about Your Money Matters on NDTV Profit, and my name is Alex Matthew. The show gets you actionable insight on everything personal finance related, whether it is investments or expenses or something like deciding whether to break your EPF to buy a house. In fact, that's not a random topic. That is the topic for today. So let's talk about it. If you're in the market for a house, if this is the first house that you're thinking of buying, and this is the house that you plan to live in for a long period of time, should you utilize the amount of money that you might have accumulated in your employee provident fund? Can you even do that? And what are the reasons why you should contemplate doing this? Mrin Agarwal, financial educator and founder of Finsafe India, joining me for this conversation. Mrin, thanks so much for taking the time. First, before we get to the EPF bit, let me ask you about this, right? Because a lot of people contemplate buying houses and this emerges into the lexicon or the conversation points when rates are cut, when interest rates are cut. And we're pretty much at the lowest point. We might see another 25 basis point cut. What should you bear in mind before you do go out and buy a house?
So, hello, Alex, and thank you for having me on the show. And I think this is a very pertinent question that, what should we bear in mind before we actually look at thinking of buying a house? I think, although right now you can get as high as 80 to 90% as loan to value, but I think just from a financial planning perspective, there are 2-3 things that one really needs to keep in mind. The first really being that it is important that you try to make at least 30 to 40% as down payment, because then what you're really doing is reducing your interest burden. And, very simply put, when you're buying a house and you're taking a loan against it, then, something that is worth 100 rupees is actually costing you 200 rupees because the interest that you're paying for the house is actually compounding, right? So bear that in mind. And I always say that buying a house is not a financial decision. It's more an emotional decision, because you buy it because it's something that you value a lot, and which is fine. But be mindful that how can you keep your interest low, which is, as I said, by a good down payment. And ideally, your EMIs totally as a percentage of your family's take home should not be more than 30% of the take home. So as long as you're within that limit, I think it should be fine.
Okay. So, and a couple of follow-up questions from that perspective as well, just to ensure that my viewer is thinking about these things before signing the check, which is, you've said 30 to 40% of down payment. And let's face it, in places like Mumbai, where properties and prices are going up to 2.5, 3 crore even, that's a considerable amount of money. So the question is, how much should you be okay eroding the amount of money that you've kept aside for your nest egg, for your retirement, etc., in order to fund this?
Oh, I would not want to touch anything that I've kept for retirement. And, Alex, this is a very common thing where people look at things that are easily accessible and use it for the down payment. But I think there's always a trade-off. And, one needs to basically figure out that it needs to keep in mind this particular trade-off, because the end of the day, the money that you're saving for retirement is also absolutely necessary. Whereas, honestly, if you ask me, buying a home is not an absolute necessity. As I said, it is something that it's more of an emotional decision. You feel good that you're owning this place called your home. But, from a financial planning perspective, certainly it's not a great decision. So I think, you need to figure out where you're going to get that down payment money from. And certainly it cannot be from your retirement funds.
And you're saying that particularly because the rental yield, which effectively is the annual rent as a percentage of the value of the house, is pretty much at 3% or 2%, sometimes even lower in certain pockets. And so therefore, the trade-off is, if you were to invest that money that you spend on buying a house in the market, or even put it in a fixed deposit or a debt instrument, you would be earning more than double, at least more than double of what you would earn if you were to buy a house. The trade-off, of course, is that if you were to rent, you're paying a significantly lower amount of money as well. But having said that, since we spoke about retirement, let me ask you this. should you use your EPF money in order to fund this? Because ultimately, if you're in the first 10 years of your career, you've still accumulated a sizable chunk of money here.
I will say absolutely not. I always believe that the EPF is meant for retirement. It is your financial security for retirement. And I would like to, talk about this with an example. So let us say that we're assuming somebody who's 30 years old and this person has got a 3 lakh rupees basic, right? Now, the accumulated corpus for this person at the age of 60 is going to be around 2.3 crores roughly, okay? Taking into account both the employer and the employee contribution, right? Now, at the age of 35, now I have assumed that this person started working at the age of 23, and we have assumed a 6% increase every year in the salary and hence 6% increase in the basic as well. Now, at the age of 35, the person actually has only 12 lakhs to withdraw. So, honestly, it's not such a great amount for the person. I mean, it's really not going to help them much if, even in other cities where the cost of houses are at least 2 crores, it's not really going to help you that much, right? Now, what is the trade-off here, right? So you remove this 12 lakh rupees, right, to fund whatever purchase. But what do you lose out in EPF? So instead of getting 2.3 crores EPF at the age of 60, your corpus is going to be 1.4 crores roughly. I mean, not 50% lesser, but certainly much, much lesser. Even if this person were to remove the money at 40, right, the amount that they can withdraw is around 23 lakhs. So again, it's not a very, very big amount that they can withdraw, but the impact on the EPF is huge. So again, versus 2.3 crores, you will get half, which is 1.15 crores by actually removing the withdrawal, the 90%. So the rule says that you can withdraw after 3 years, you can withdraw 90% of the accumulated corpus, which is employer plus employee contribution plus interest on that. So if you actually do these withdrawals, I think you're losing a lot more. And this is simply because of compounding, right? And, again, what happens is that, see, when you actually when I looked at the cash flow, right? So from 23 to 50 years, you made a corpus of about 90 lakhs to a crore. But from 50 to 60, that same corpus grew from 90 lakhs to the 2.3 crores, right? So essentially, if you're actually withdrawing the money early on, and I'm not propagating withdrawing the money even between 50 and 60. The point is that if you're actually withdrawing the money, then, you're really losing out on the biggest benefit that the product has, which is compounding.
Yeah, absolutely. And the magic, as they say, of compounding happens the longer you keep things untouched or you don't dip into it, right, for whatever reason. And I'm glad that you spoke about the rule, because it's important to know what your options are, even if you shouldn't consider using it unless it's a last resort, right? So, but let me ask you this then. So you're trying to manage your buying of a house through your regular paycheck. And the best case scenario, Mrin, is to be able to buy a house where the amount that you're paying on rent is comparable to the EMI that you might have to pay. Would you say that that's a fair assessment?
Yeah, that is a fair assessment.
And so therefore, what needs to happen for that EMI to be at that level? You need to be able to put a significant portion in the down payment, and you might need to push the tenor down the road, right? So instead of taking a 10-year or a 15-year loan, you might have to take a 20, 25-year loan. But are there drawbacks to doing that?
Yes, of course, because at the end of the day, you're paying out a higher amount as interest, right? When you're taking a longer term loan. And, this is where I would actually say that, in the current situation, I think it's important for people to assess, do I really need that house, right? Because see, today the cost of housing has gone up so much. And at the end of the day, it's quite difficult for everybody to save for that down payment. And if we do very often, Alex, see people who are having 70% of their income, which is actually going to EMIs. And they don't realize the implication of that is that in the long term, you might have an asset with you, but you have much lesser liquidity, and the amount of wealth that you actually have is much lesser because, again, I would like to say this, the interest that you're paying out is actually compounding.
Yeah.
So I think it's very important for people to understand that, can I actually afford buying this house? Also, another thing, when I look at the data on price rise in as per the index, which is put out regularly, when you look at that data, it actually shows you that the returns are in single digit. They are somewhere maybe 7 to 8%. So, you have to look at it from all of these angles.
So let me ask you this then. So you're saying that people should review whether they need to rush into buying a house. But would you say that everybody should have a house eventually? You're just saying that you don't necessarily have to buy it now. You could actually save a large amount of money, and you can let that money compound over a period of time. And then whenever you're settled, whenever you know for a fact that you're going to stay in a city and you don't have the possibility that your job can change and you can move, or you can have to move at the drop of a hat, that you should at that moment think and say, okay, this is when I can buy a house. And then you can take a large portion from what you've saved up.
Absolutely, I would agree with you. And again, this whole savings spending conundrum really comes down to looking at what is most fulfilling to you and planning for it, right? I think today, because of the easy availability of loans, everybody jumps into these loans without understanding the longer term financial implications.
Yeah, that's fair. So let me ask you this as well. For those people that have actually bitten the bullet and gone and bought a house, with the shift to the new tax regime, now a lot of people did this over the last 3 to 5 years thinking that they would avail of significant tax benefits. But those tax benefits are now available only in the old tax regime under Section 24, where you can have 2 lakh rupees worth of your interest payments on a house loan that is deducted or exempt from income tax. But most people have moved to the new tax regime, so that's not available to them. Would you say that now is the best time, if you've taken a loan in the last 2 to 3 years, to prepay that loan as aggressively as possible?
Oh yes, I always, forget. I mean, I'm not so driven by the tax deduction benefits, and I would always say that it's always good to get debt free as soon as possible. So, but yes, certainly, if the tax deduction was an important factor for you, and now that it doesn't exist, then all the more reason to look at paying off your loans at the earliest. But of course, keeping in mind that you need to have a good balance, with liquidity. And I'm saying this again and again about liquidity, because again, we can't just do one thing. Like, we can't just say that we'll repay all the loans, but then, we're not saving for our other goals, or we're not saving for retirement, for example.
Fair point. I think we've had a holistic conversation. Mrin, thanks so much for taking the time. I think the crux for me in this conversation was that you should not break your nest egg or your EPF if you don't have to. Thanks so much for taking the time.
Thank you.